Footprints? On the ceiling? This is no ordinary crime. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravela. Tell me, what city, what corner of the world are you watching from? I always love reading your comments. Let's dive in. Narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. It was on a morning in early November, dull, overcast, and so damp that even the relentless clip of handsome wheels along Baker Street sounded subdued, that I returned to our rooms to find Sherlock Holmes, already dressed, gloved, and standing by the fire in a state of rare agitation. "There you are, Watson," he said the moment I entered. "Perfect. I trust you've breakfasted? We're about to be summoned." "I've just come from the club," I said, removing my overcoat. "Summoned to where?" "To the Theatre of the Impossible," Holmes replied cryptically. "A lady has called in a riddle of such delicious absurdity that I could not dream of refusing it." I'd barely time to inquire further before Mrs. Hudson showed in a pale, elegant woman of perhaps 35, dressed impeccably in dark plum velvet, though her eyes betrayed a restlessness that no fashion could conceal. "Mr. Holmes," she began with urgency, "I am Lady Amelia Montcroix. I must apologize for this intrusion, but, well, there is something terrible happening at Alderbridge Hall." Holmes bowed his head slightly. "I assure you, Lady Montcroix, I'm at your service. You mentioned in your telegram a matter of footprints. On a ceiling, if I read it correctly?" She gave a nervous laugh that held no amusement. "Yes, it sounds mad, I know, but it's true." "Then I'm twice as intrigued." Lady Montcroix's voice faltered for a moment. "My husband, Lord Philip Montcroix, hosts a ball every November, always the second Saturday. It's a family tradition, but this morning when the staff went in to begin clearing the ballroom from last night's festivities, they found something incomprehensible." "Yes," Holmes said, fingers steepled. "Footprints, human ones, bare feet even, on the ballroom ceiling, perfectly visible in the chandelier light directly above the center of the room." "Were they wet?" Holmes asked sharply. "Number dry, dusty even. Like someone had walked through soot or fine ash. They weren't there last night. My husband is livid, of course, believing it must be a prank, but the room was locked, and then there is the matter of the guest who has disappeared." "Ah," Holmes murmured, his expression sharpening. "Now we are entering firmer ground." "Miss Iris Denham," Lady Montcroix said. "She's a young pianist, a friend of my husband's cousin. She was seen leaving the ballroom around 11:30 to fetch her shawl. She never returned. Her belongings are still in her room. No one saw her leave the house, and the grounds were watched by 2 footmen because of a recent theft in the area. We feared," her voice dropped, "that she may have been abducted." "Or worse," I said quietly. Lady Montcroix turned to me, startled. "Exactly." Holmes paced to the window, drawing aside the curtain as if the fog might clarify things. "Who among the guests had access to the ballroom after the festivities?" "No one. The doors are locked from the outside. It's only ever unlocked by the steward in the morning." "And the steward confirms they were locked when he opened them?" "Yes. The keys were in his coat pocket all night, and the ballroom has no other doors." "Windows?" 10 of them, but all at least 12 feet off the ground, and the shutters were bolted from within. The room was as sealed as a tomb." Holmes smiled slightly. "Sealed tombs often contain more than they ought to." Lady Montcroix's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "Mr. Holmes, I know how this sounds, but please, I saw the prints myself. They aren't smudges or illusions. They are clear, 5 toes, an arch, a heel, and they lead nowhere. They just stop, right above the chandelier, as if someone had walked halfway across the ceiling and vanished." There was a silence then. Holmes's eyes were gleaming. "You are correct, Lady Montcroix. It does sound mad, which is why I'm inclined to believe you. Only the impossible is worthy of our full attention." He turned to me with a rare look of anticipation. "Watson, pack your bag. We leave on the noon train to Surrey." As Lady Montcroix departed with quiet gratitude, Holmes moved to his desk, plucked out Bradshaw's railway timetable, and flipped pages with practiced efficiency. "Alderbridge Hall," he murmured. "A fine old estate, built in 1792 if memory serves. Ballroom added in 1840. An oddity of architecture, high ceilings, unsupported corners. I believe the floor above it is unused, a gallery perhaps. You've heard of the place?" "Once," he said absently, "in connection with a fire. Or nearly a fire. A small one, perhaps, that never reached the reports." He closed the book and looked up. "The game is afoot, Watson. We are not chasing pranksters or dreams. We are pursuing a question so strange, even logic will have to lean sideways." I had seen that look before. The hunger for a problem, the sharpening of all his senses around a single mystery. I confess, I felt it too. There was something deeply unsettling about the idea of a vanished girl, footprints defying gravity, and a sealed room with no answer. "Do you suspect murder?" I asked. "I suspect something cleverer," Holmes replied, "which usually amounts to the same thing." And with that, we stepped into the fog. We arrived at Alderbridge Hall just as dusk gathered across the Surrey hills, turning the turrets and ivy-strangled eaves of the estate into silhouettes against a waning violet sky. The manor stood imposingly at the edge of a sloping lawn, its windows lit with the dim orange warmth of oil lamps flickering behind heavy curtains. Despite its grandeur, there was a hush about the place, a sort of reverent silence that struck me as unnatural for a household that had hosted a ball only a day before. Lady Montcroix met us at the doors herself, her face drawn tighter than it had been that morning. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. There have been developments." "Developments are always welcome," Holmes said briskly, removing his gloves as he stepped inside. "Even when they point towards something sinister." She hesitated only a moment before leading us through the marbled entrance and up a wide staircase, her voice low and urgent. "The prints are still there. No one has touched the room, per your instructions. But another matter has emerged. This morning, one of the footmen was found unconscious in the East Wing corridor. No wound, no struggle. Just lying there. The doctor suspects some form of poisoning, but no substance has been identified." Holmes quickened his step beside her. "Which footman?" "Algernon Pike. He was one of the two watching the grounds during the ball." "And the other?" "Samuel Haynes. He insists he never left the garden terrace, but no one can account for Pike's movements between midnight and when the housekeeper found him at 5. Holmes grunted. "A man collapses with no struggle, no visible injury, and no memory, and a young woman disappears from a sealed house. Curious." Lady Montcroix led us down a second corridor and gestured toward a set of oak double doors flanked by twin gas lamps. The ballroom. Holmes motioned for her to stay back, then slowly turned the handle and stepped inside. I followed. The room was magnificent. Vaulted ceiling, golden trim, and parquet floors polished to a mirror shine. Tall windows stood behind iron-grilled shutters, each securely bolted. But the true spectacle was above. There they were, clear as footprints in sand, only inverted. A line of sooty marks, each distinct in shape and pressure, beginning about 10 feet above the floor, trailing across the ceiling, and halting mid-air just above the chandelier's highest curve. Each print was left foot, right foot, progressing in stride as if someone had strolled across the plaster upside down and vanished halfway through the act. Holmes stood in silence for a full minute. He removed his magnifying glass and studied the floor first, running his long fingers lightly over the boards directly beneath the chandelier. "No ash or residue here," he murmured. "Nothing has fallen, so the prints were not transferred from foot to ceiling by inversion." He walked slowly in a spiral pattern, studying the air itself as if expecting it to yield some invisible thread. "Watson," he said quietly, "look closely at the angle of the prints. Do you see it?" I stared upward, squinting. They tilt slightly. The toes angle toward the far wall. Precisely, suggesting not merely an impossible act of defiance to gravity, but purposeful motion. A crossing, not a display. He turned and examined the chandelier itself, a grand, sprawling thing of brass and crystal. "Lady Montcroix," he called without turning, "has anyone tampered with this fixture recently?" She stepped cautiously into the room. "Not since the spring. We lower it by pulley once a year to clean the glass. But it wasn't touched this month." "Show me the mechanism." She led us to a panel hidden behind one of the room's wall hangings. Holmes examined the wheel and cable system, then tugged lightly on the brass chain. "Good engineering," he muttered. "Sound, and no signs of recent friction or soot. No tampering." He returned to the center of the room and stood beneath the prints once more. "These are not theatrical," he said finally. "Nor are they tricks of shadow, and most importantly, they are not meant to be noticed. They are evidence left in spite of the perpetrator's efforts." "You think the culprit didn't intend them to be seen?" "Not at all. If this were meant as a message or illusion, they would be clearer or exaggerated. But no, these were functional, a means to an end." He turned to Lady Montcroix. "May I see Miss Denham's room?" She nodded, visibly rattled. "Of course. It's just down the guest corridor." We followed her across a smaller staircase to the eastern wing. The guest corridor had 5 rooms, each identical in layout, each still bearing signs of the ball's aftermath. Stray gloves, corsage pins, feather fans left askew. Miss Denham's room was the 3rd. Holmes entered slowly, eyes alert. The bed was made, but a shawl lay draped across its foot. A satchel stood neatly at the vanity, half unpacked. A sheet of piano music rested on the writing desk, the ink fresh and smudged where her hand had clearly turned the corner too fast. "She left in haste," Holmes murmured, "without shawl or luggage, yet took nothing of value." He moved to the window and unlatched the casement. It opened with effort, revealing a view of the east garden path below. The sill was dusted but unmarked. No signs of exit. Holmes closed it again and turned his attention to the wardrobe. "Empty save for a second dress," he said. "She came expecting to stay." He ran his fingers along the frame, then crouched to inspect the floor beneath it. "Watson, come look at this." I joined him to see a fine, crescent-shaped smear, dull gray like graphite or old soot, just at the edge of the floorboard beneath the wardrobe. "It's the same substance," I said quietly. "Exactly." He rose and dusted his hands. "Lady Montcroix, who else knew Miss Denham? You mentioned a cousin." "Yes, Reuben Halliwell. He's my husband's cousin, and Miss Denham was his guest. He's still here. Summon him if you would." She left us alone in the room. Holmes stood at the desk, turning over the piano sheet in his hand. "This piece," he said. "It's not published. See the notation, too personal. She wrote this herself. And see here, Largo tremante, hold back for signal. That's not standard musical direction." "A code?" I asked. "A message to herself, perhaps for performance. Or something else. If I am not mistaken, Miss Denham left behind something far more intentional than a forgotten shawl." There was a knock, and a tall young man entered with a sheepish air. He was perhaps 28, thin-limbed, and bore the air of a man who preferred clubs to country estates. "Mr. Holmes?" he said. "Reuben Halliwell. I was told you wanted to speak with me about Iris." "Yes, Mr. Halliwell. A few questions. You brought Miss Denham to the ball." "Indeed. I met her through a friend at the Royal College of Music. She's quite brilliant. Very shy, though. I thought the gathering might be good for her." Holmes studied him. "You say she was shy, and yet she agreed to perform?" Halliwell blinked. "She didn't. That is, she hadn't yet. She said she'd consider it, but she never played at the ball." Holmes turned back to the desk, his voice deceptively mild. Curious, because this composition was prepared for performance. Tonight, did she have any enemies among the guests? Enemies? No. Why would she? Who spoke with her last? Halliwell looked uncertain. I'm not sure. I saw her near the piano at about 11. Then I went to the smoking room. I assumed she went to bed early. It was too loud for her. Holmes nodded once. Thank you, Mr. Halliwell. That will be all. For now. As the young man exited, Holmes looked down at the sheet music again. There's something here, Watson. A piece of a larger melody. She didn't disappear. She was taken, but not by force. Lured. Voluntarily, but under false pretense. And the prince? Someone else was already in the house. Or above it. He moved to the corridor and looked up at the ceiling beams running along the hall. The ceiling of the ballroom, he said softly, shares structure with the unused gallery upstairs, a space no one enters. A space where someone could walk, if the floor were stripped and reversed. You think someone was in the ceiling? I think someone never left it. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. And that, Watson, is where we begin to listen for footsteps that never touch the ground. Holmes did not speak as we ascended the narrow servants' stairwell that twisted up the eastern turret and into the oldest part of Alderbridge Hall. The candle in his hand cast long shadows along the rough-plastered walls, the light wavering over crumbling cornices and thick cobwebs undisturbed by decades. The gallery above the ballroom had not been used in years, according to Lady Montcroix's brief remarks. It had once served as a music loft, though time and disuse had turned it into a storage place for broken furniture and dusty linens. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, and the scent that greeted us was dry rot, dust, and something older still. A faint but unmistakable trace of coal smoke. Holmes stepped inside first, moving carefully across the warped boards. The air was thick, the silence nearly absolute, save for the faint whisper of wind slipping through a cracked eave. The room stretched over the entire length of the ballroom below, and though most of the floor was intact, patches of exposed beam showed where wooden planks had rotted away or been lifted. Careful, Holmes murmured. Step only where I do. I followed him closely, my own candle catching the gleam of something metallic near the far corner. Holmes stooped, revealing a rusted hinge affixed to a flat wooden panel. He pressed against it gently, and the panel lifted with a low scrape, revealing an open crawlspace beneath. Interesting, he said softly. This shouldn't be here. Not in the center of the gallery. I peered down. It was little more than a cramped shaft, but at the bottom I could make out a disused mechanism. Old wheels and pulleys, parts of the chandelier's original counterbalance, no longer in service. And then, to the side, I saw it, the smudge of soot against the inside rim of the shaft. Holmes noted it too. Soot again, the same kind. Someone moved through here, deliberately, and likely recently. Come. We crossed to the western end of the gallery, where dust hung thick in the corners. Holmes paused before a low wooden bench and knelt beside it. From beneath, he drew out a small leather pouch, worn but not ancient. With a surgeon's care, he unfastened the clasp. Inside were 3 items, a stub of candle wrapped in linen, a folded paper marked with a crescent moon drawn in charcoal, and a small glass vial containing an amber-colored residue. Holmes examined the vial first, then sniffed the rim. His expression darkened. Chloral hydrate, a sedative commonly used in sleeping draughts. Mixed with alcohol, it becomes more potent still. The footman? I asked. Almost certainly. Unconsciousness without injury, very much its signature. But why here? He returned the vial and unfolded the slip of paper. The drawing of the crescent moon was crude but deliberate. A signal? I asked. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Or an appointment. This, he added, rising, was not a random act. Miss Denham was meant to be brought here. He turned and paced back to the exposed joists where the ceiling to the ballroom lay directly beneath our feet. Kneeling again, he traced one beam with his finger, then looked at me. "Watson, do you recall the angle of the footprints? How they curved slightly as if following the room's arc?" I nodded. "This beam leads exactly along that trajectory. If someone walked barefoot here with soot on their soles, perhaps from that candle stub, and then the beam was covered with only a thin plaster sheet, it could explain the inverted prints below. But why bare feet? Grip, precision, or to avoid making noise on the wood. Boots would creak. Skin does not." He returned to the trap door and pointed at the pulley wheels below. "The culprit descended through here, and I believe they brought Miss Denham with them." "Then she's somewhere in this house," I said quietly, "unless she's been removed already." Holmes replaced the pouch where he had found it, then straightened with a grim look. "We must speak to the steward. I want a full accounting of who passed through this wing during the past week. Guests, staff, deliverymen, anyone. There's a pattern forming, Watson. We have a young woman skilled in music who disappears without struggle, a footprint trail not meant to be seen, and a sleeping footman rendered inert. And now a gallery above a sealed ballroom, complete with candlelight, drug residue, and strange markings. As we descended, the air seemed heavier somehow, the house itself reluctant to yield what it knew. Holmes moved quickly through the corridor and down to the servants' wing. There we found the steward, a thin and grey-haired man named Hargrove, whose posture was rigid and voice deferential to the point of dryness. "No one has been assigned to the gallery in years, sir," Hargrove said after Holmes inquired. "We keep it locked. The only key is on this ring here." Holmes held out his hand, and Hargrove dropped the heavy ring into his palm. Holmes selected the gallery key and held it up to the light. There, barely visible on the edge, was a smudge of soot. He turned the key in his fingers thoughtfully. "You haven't accessed this in months, Hargrove?" "No, sir. Not since Lady Montcroix requested old table linens for the spring fete. That would have been in April, I believe." Holmes returned the key and asked to see the guest registry. Hargrove retrieved a leather-bound logbook from the steward's desk and opened it with care. Holmes turned the pages slowly, reading the names aloud under his breath. Many were unremarkable. Friends of the family, titled guests from surrounding counties, and a few artists and musicians. Then Holmes paused. "Here, see this entry. Guest arrived Wednesday last. Mr. Gabriel Laroche, accompanist, sponsored by Reuben Halliwell." "I saw no accompanist at the ball," I said. "Nor I," Holmes replied. "Did Mr. Laroche perform?" Hargrove looked uncertain. "Not to my knowledge, sir. He was assigned the green room off the north corridor, but I haven't seen him since the morning of the ball." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then we must inspect his room." The green room was modest, clean and clearly unoccupied. The bed was made. A folded suit jacket lay on a chair and a closed valise sat beneath the writing desk. Holmes knelt beside it and, after a moment's silent inquiry to the room, unlatched the case. Inside were perfectly pressed evening clothes, a set of musical scores, all bearing annotations in the same distinctive charcoal hand as the paper in the gallery. And, in the inner flap, a business card. Gabriel Laroche, accompanist and composition tutor. Special engagements, private commissions, St. John's Music Hall, Bloomsbury. Holmes turned the card over. Scrawled in ink on the back was a simple message. "Ask her to play the 7th chord. Wait for silence." He folded the card and slipped it into his coat pocket. "This man, Watson, has not merely vanished. He planned to. And if I am not mistaken, Miss Denham was his instrument as much as his pupil. But to what end?" Holmes moved to the window. "That is what we must find out. But one thing is clear. Laroche was not here to accompany a ball. He came to accompany a disappearance." As we turned to leave, I caught Holmes' eye and saw it again. That gleam of certainty he only displayed when the game's shape had begun to emerge from the mist. "We need to speak with Halliwell again," Holmes said. "He's either an unwitting dupe or something far worse." And with that, he strode down the corridor toward the main stairwell, the candle in his hand casting long shadows behind us, like silent witnesses to the lies that had taken root in Alderbridge Hall. We found Reuben Halliwell in the library, alone, standing before a half-empty decanter of port with a tumbler dangling loosely in his hand. He turned as we entered, trying rather too quickly to appear composed. Holmes offered him no greeting, only a direct and measured gaze. "Mr. Halliwell," Holmes said quietly, "you vouched for Gabriel Laroche when he arrived at Alderbridge Hall. I now ask you to tell me the exact nature of your relationship with him." Halliwell blinked, as if the question had struck too soon. "We're acquaintances. We met at a salon in Bloomsbury last year. He was performing with a cellist I knew. We spoke briefly, exchanged cards. When Lady Montcroix mentioned she wished for some refined music at the ball, I suggested him." "You hadn't seen him since last year?" Holmes asked. "No, not until he arrived this week. And yet you sponsored his stay, despite not having heard him perform recently and knowing little of his character." Halliwell's jaw twitched. "He seemed competent, polished. I thought he might bring something different. Iris liked the idea." "She knew him beforehand?" No. I introduced them on Thursday morning, but they got on quickly. They were both musical, after all." Holmes moved toward the fireplace, his voice still calm. "Mr. Halliwell, you say you saw Miss Denham near the piano at 11 o'clock on the night of the ball. That was the last time anyone recalls seeing her. But we have now found signs, clear signs, that she may have been lured away by Mr. Laroche. You claimed earlier that you assumed she retired early, but surely when you noticed she hadn't returned, and when she was absent by morning, you must have wondered." Halliwell's fingers tightened on the glass. "Of course I did. But I didn't think... she was a private person. I thought perhaps she needed space." "You did not raise the alarm," Holmes said flatly. "I didn't think it was my place," Halliwell replied, then added, "She wasn't my responsibility." Holmes watched him for a long moment. "But you brought her here. And you brought Laroche. 2 people vanish in a single night, and you say nothing until pressed. Forgive me if I find your sense of distance curious." "I didn't know anything," Halliwell said with a note of rising panic. "I swear it." "Then I suggest you begin remembering," Holmes said. "Where were you between midnight and 3 o'clock that night?" Halliwell hesitated. "I went to the smoking lounge with Frederick Morden and Charles Redmayne," he said after too long. "We had cigars and talked about horses. I may have fallen asleep there. I woke up around 3 and returned to my room." "Can your companions confirm this?" He nodded quickly. "Ask them, please." Holmes inclined his head. "I shall. But understand this, Mr. Halliwell. If I find that you concealed any knowledge of Laroche's intentions or Miss Denham's fate, I shall see you answer for it." Halliwell's face was pale by the time we turned to go. As we exited into the corridor, I spoke softly. "You believe he's lying." "I believe he is frightened," Holmes replied, "and men are rarely frightened without reason." We made directly for the servants' wing once more, where the steward Hargrove informed us that a letter had arrived earlier by special courier, addressed to Lady Montcroix. Holmes asked to see it, and within moments we were standing once more in the drawing-room as she broke the seal under Holmes's eye. The letter was short. 5 lines, written in the same elegant, looping hand we had seen on the musical scores. "You cannot contain silence. She went where music ends. Do not look behind the veil. The echoes are not yours to command. Let the moonlight pass untouched." Lady Montcroix looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. "What on earth does this mean?" Holmes took the letter and held it near the window, angling it toward the light. "It is not a threat. It is a ritual. This is theater masquerading as message. You think it's from La Roche? I asked. Unquestionably, but not to taunt, to obscure. He believes himself an artist first and foremost. This is the language of symbolism. He wants to be interpreted. Holmes folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his breast pocket. Watson, I need to examine the piano. We returned at once to the ballroom. The staff had been instructed to leave the space untouched, and the Steinway Grand still sat near the southern wall, its lacquered lid closed, reflecting the dim chandelier light above. Holmes sat at the bench, lifted the lid, and gently pressed the lowest keys. A deep, resonant note rang out. He played slowly upward, one chord at a time. Listen carefully, he said. The fourth chord he played, a strange dissonant progression in G-sharp minor, emitted a faint buzz as if something loose within the instrument had responded. He lifted the keyboard lid and peered inside. Here, he said. Watson, look. I leaned over and saw it. Wedged beneath the fourth string, just behind the hammer, was a slip of folded vellum. Holmes drew it out with tweezers and unfolded it. It bore one word. Below. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw his eyes glint. He stood, crossed to the wall nearest the piano, and began tapping at the panels. A hollow sound replied from the third panel. He stepped back and called for a servant. Bring a lantern and crowbar. Within minutes, the panel had been carefully removed, revealing an ancient servant's stair, spiral and narrow, descending into blackness. Dust choked the air, and the first few steps crumbled underfoot. Holmes lit the lantern himself. This passage is not on the steward's floor plan, he said. It's older, possibly original to the manor's foundations. We descended carefully. The stair gave way to a short corridor of stone, damp and close, and at the far end stood a narrow iron door. It was bolted from our side. Holmes drew the bolt slowly. The hinges groaned as he pushed the door inward. Inside was a small chamber, no more than 15 feet across. The walls were stone, lined with shelves filled with old scores, manuscripts, and scattered candle stubs. A cracked mirror hung on one side. A stool sat in the center of the room, and next to it, a second, smaller piano, its keys yellowed with age. And then we saw her, Iris Denham. She was seated on the floor back against the wall, asleep or unconscious. Her hair was disheveled, but she was breathing. Holmes rushed forward and knelt beside her. She's alive, he said. Sedated, but alive. He opened her eyelids gently, checked her pulse. The same substance as before, I'd wager. Why leave her here? I asked, bewildered. Because she was meant to awaken, Holmes said, rising. Alone, confused, and perhaps convinced she had merely dreamed. And La Roche? He's gone, but he left her behind for a reason. Perhaps she refused to follow, or perhaps he never intended to take her at all, but rather to use her. Holmes turned back to the strange little piano in the center of the room and ran a finger across its keys. He built a theater underground, a secret stage beneath a grand one, and she was his captive audience. We carried Iris carefully back upstairs, where a physician was summoned. She remained unconscious but stable. Holmes stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the darkening sky over the garden. He spoke quietly, as if to himself. La Roche understood more than music. He understood control, silence, suggestion. He created a performance not for applause, but for disappearance. I stepped beside him. You believe he's fled? Holmes nodded. Yes, but we have his name, his face, and his trail. He made one mistake. He underestimated how closely a single misstep, a single footprint, could undo a perfect illusion. And as the gas lamps flickered and Miss Denham stirred faintly in her bed, the first tendrils of dawn began to pale the edge of the sky, and I knew Holmes would not sleep until the last chord had been struck. The pale light of morning had just begun to settle over Alderbridge Hall when Holmes, still without rest, stood once more in the small underground chamber where we had found Iris Denham. The fire from the hearth above had not reached this room in years. It held its own cold, a silence that felt deliberate. Holmes had brought with him the candle stub we found in the gallery, as well as the charcoal sketch of the crescent moon and the musical score with the cryptic instruction, "Largo tremante, hold back for signal." He paced slowly in the center of the room, his hands behind his back, gaze darting from shelf to shelf, as though listening for something beneath the quiet. "It is not merely a room," he murmured. "It is a stage, a ritual chamber. Every element speaks of precision, placement, acoustics, mood. But what performance was intended? What audience?" I remained near the entrance, my eyes still drawn to the aged piano in the center. "You believe Miss Denham was brought here to perform?" "No," Holmes said, turning to me. "She was brought here because she could perform. Laroche needed someone who could be led to this point, not by force, but by understanding. He spoke her language. Music. She was lured. Persuaded. Trapped in a metaphor, Watson. He didn't just drug her. He conducted her, like a composition." Holmes stepped to the piano and pressed a single key. A low, resonant note echoed, trembling slightly against the stone. Then another. A third. He played the chord we had found marked on her music. Slowly, deliberately. We both heard it then. A whisper, so faint it might have been wind. Or memory. A breath drawn deep in the stones. Holmes leaned forward. He designed the room to respond, to reverberate at certain frequencies. The echoes were part of it. That was his illusion, making her believe she had gone somewhere else. Heard things others could not. He turned to the mirror on the wall, cracked and tarnished. It seemed inconsequential, but Holmes tapped the edge and a hollow ring sounded. He stepped back and examined the wall. A faint seam traced a rectangle around the mirror's frame. "Help me," he said. We cleared the dust and candle wax from the base. Holmes wedged the tip of his knife between the seam and pulled gently. The mirror swung, outward like a door, revealing a shallow recess. Inside was a coat, a dark overcoat, long and heavy, folded carefully around something wrapped in linen. Holmes removed it and unwrapped the object. A mask, hand-carved from pale wood, stylized with exaggerated lips and eyes, painted faintly with gold leaf and dark musical notation that looped from brow to jaw. He held it up in the half-light. "The conductor's mask," he said, "the final illusion. She was to awaken to find this. Perhaps worn by Laroche, perhaps left for her to find. Either way, it suggests a performance not for others, but for herself. He wanted her to question her senses, her memory, possibly even her sanity." He rewrapped the mask carefully and turned to the door. "We must return to London," he said. "There are too many threads here, and one of them will lead us to Laroche." By the time we boarded the train back to the city, Iris Denham had stirred more fully. She had spoken briefly to Lady Montcroix, confused but unharmed. She remembered fragments, walking alone through a corridor she didn't recognize, following the sound of music, a man speaking softly, urging her to play. Then darkness. Her memory broke like a dropped mirror from there. Holmes absorbed this in silence before we departed. On the train, he was still for a long while, his gaze fixed on the grey blur of the passing countryside. "Iris Denham was selected," he said at last. "Not for her fame, she has none, but for her susceptibility. Laroche knew precisely how to reach her. Her scores suggest a tendency toward dreamlike structure, unconventional signatures, emotionally porous work. The perfect subject." He leaned forward slightly. "Now, Watson, we must see what the Royal College of Music knows about Gabriel Laroche." We arrived at the college just before 3 o'clock and were received by the registrar, a spectacled woman of strict posture who required only a brief mention of Scotland Yard to grow cooperative. She led us to a records room and withdrew a slim folder from the shelf. "There is little," she said. "He studied here briefly 6 years ago. Composition and harmony. Very talented but erratic. Never finished his final exams. Disappeared midway through term." Holmes scanned the pages. "Any known associates?" "A cellist named Robert Vinn. The two performed together for a short while. Vinn is with the Dalamer Quartet now, I believe. Teaches on Wednesdays." "Is he in London?" "Yes. Teaches privately in Bloomsbury." Holmes closed the file. "Then we are on the right scent." Within the hour, we found Vinn's address. An ivy-draped townhouse not far from Tavistock Square. Vinn answered the door himself, a lean man with silvering temples and the narrow eyes of a habitual observer. At the mention of La Roche, his lips pressed thin. "I haven't heard that name in 3 years," he said. "But I'm not surprised it surfaced. You'd better come in." We followed him into a studio crammed with music stands, cellos in cases, a kettle steaming softly on a side table. Vinn motioned for us to sit. "Gabriel Laroche was gifted," he said. "No doubt about it. He had a way of drawing people into his vision. His music was unsettling in the best way. But he believed too much in its power. He thought sound could reveal truth or distort it. He once said the right sequence of chords could cause someone to forget who they were." "Did he ever mention Alderbridge Hall?" Holmes asked. "Number, but he often talked about silence chambers. Rooms designed to confuse the senses. Acoustic experiments, he called them. He thought that certain architectural spaces could act like instruments. You see, to Gabriel, the mind was just another chamber, one you could tune if you knew how." "And masks?" Holmes pressed. Vinn paused. "Yes, he carved them. Said they helped separate the self from the performance. He wore one during an experimental recital, faced away from the audience, played behind a curtain. It was haunting. People left in tears. He said afterward that he hadn't played. It had played through him." Holmes leaned forward. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. We fell out. He was working on something in Cornwall. Said he needed stone and sea and silence. Something about an echo that never ended." Holmes stood. "You've been more help than you know." As we stepped back into the street, the wind had begun to pick up, grey clouds roiling low above the rooftops. Holmes turned his collar up against the chill. "He's preparing another performance, Watson. What happened at Alderbridge was only a rehearsal." I felt a slow weight settle behind his words. "Then we haven't seen the end of this." Holmes nodded once, grimly. "Number. But when the curtain rises again, we'll be waiting in the wings." The next morning brought with it a smudged grey light and the low hum of distant foghorns, echoing across the Thames like faint, broken chords. Holmes stood motionless at the window of our Baker Street rooms, his long fingers resting on the window-sill as he watched the clouds gather low over the rooftops of London. He had spoken scarcely a word since our return from Bloomsbury, and when I brought him tea, he barely acknowledged it. I had grown used to these silences, intervals of intense inward activity where the orchestra of his mind prepared for its final crescendo. Still, there was a new weight to his stillness now, one not born entirely of contemplation. I set the tray down beside him. "You believe Vinn was telling the truth?" "Entirely," Holmes murmured without turning. There was no false note in his tone. He was weary of Laroche, not protective. That is often more revealing. He finally turned, his eyes alight beneath the quiet. We must find the source of that final remark. Stone, sea and silence. Cornwall. It is the logical place to begin. He mentioned it as if it were already fixed. Not just a location, Watson, but a destination long prepared. "You think he's gone to ground?" "No," Holmes said, crossing to his desk. "I think he's gone to perform, alone perhaps, but not in secrecy. He left a trail. He withdrew from his files a slim volume of architectural surveys. Holmes's methods never failed to surprise me. His research was not confined to criminal annals alone, but extended to archaeology, stagecraft, acoustics, and even cartography when it served his purpose. "I had an index made," he said, flipping pages. "Every stone chapel, ruin, or quarry along the southwestern coast known for its acoustic properties. One in particular has a curious history, the chapel of St. Madrona by the cliffs. Isolated, long disused, and built over a natural echo chamber formed by a sea cavern." I stepped closer. "How did you come across it?" "During the Featherstone affair. I noted it while researching smugglers' paths along the Cornwall coast. I recall its ceiling is shaped like a reversed amphitheater. A sound made at its center resonates without discernible source." "An ideal place for LaRoche," I said. Holmes nodded, already reaching for the Bradshaw timetable. "There's a train to Penzance in 40 minutes. If we make haste, we'll arrive by nightfall and can ride by hired trap to the village of Trescombe. From there, the chapel is but a mile's walk. Remote, unlit, and all the more revealing under moonlight." By late evening, after a long and unremarkable journey broken only by Holmes's occasional murmurs into his notebook, we arrived at the wind-swept cliffs of the Cornish coast. The hamlet of Trescombe clung to the land like an afterthought, its thatched roofs hunched low against the wind. Our hired driver, a dour man named Harris, had heard of the chapel but claimed no one went near it after sundown. "Madrona's a place for ghosts, sir," he said gruffly. "Cursed in the old days. Voices under the rocks, they say. Fishermen hear them on calm nights." "Perfect," Holmes said simply, and bade him wait at the edge of the path. We walked the rest of the way on foot, the narrow trail winding through high bracken and along the precipice edge. Below, the sea crashed in rhythm against the hidden caverns, the air heavy with brine and the scent of wet stone. The chapel appeared abruptly, a squat, slate-roofed structure half swallowed by the surrounding cliffs, its walls streaked with salt and time. No lights burned within. Holmes pushed the rotting door inward, and we stepped into a darkness so complete it swallowed sound. He lit a lantern. The inside was barren. The pews had long since rotted, leaving only their stone outlines. The altar had crumbled, but the floor bore a strange clarity, every inch swept clean, the stone worn smooth by footfalls, both ancient and recent. But at the center stood a music stand. Holmes approached it slowly. Upon the stand sat a single sheet of music, hand-penned in the same dark looping notation we had seen before. "It's a score," he murmured, "but not one meant for audience or orchestra. This is a solitary composition, a ritual piece." He examined it more closely. The same motif repeated, building, modulating, collapsing, rising again. "Here, this measure," he pointed. "It matches the Largo Tremante we saw in Miss Denham's notes. He has reworked it, layered it with something else." From the shadows behind the altar came a faint sound. Both of us turned at once. A figure emerged slowly, barefoot, pale-faced, dressed in a dark frock coat worn thin at the elbows. The man's hair was longer now than in the photograph we had seen, but his eyes held that same distant brilliance. Gabriel Laroche. He did not seem surprised to see us. If anything, he looked vaguely amused. "I wondered if it would be you," he said. "You heard the final movement." Holmes stepped forward. "We heard enough. Miss Denham is safe." Laroche gave a soft nod. "She was always meant to be." Holmes narrowed his gaze. "You drugged her, manipulated her, built illusions around her perception of reality." "I gave her a silence she had never known," Laroche replied calmly. "Not absence, but a clarity, an interior space without interruption. That is all I ever offered. And if she had not awoken?" "She would have," he said simply. "She was strong enough. I chose her carefully. You must understand, Mr. Holmes, this was not cruelty. It was composition. I do not deal in violence. I only reshape the frame. Holmes's voice was quiet, but sharp. You used chloroform. You left unconscious victims in your wake. One of them could have died. Unintended, Laroche said, without remorse, but necessary. You cannot build without clearing the old foundations. He stepped toward the music stand, not threatening, but deliberate. Would you like to hear it? He asked. Holmes didn't move. I would prefer to hear your confession. You already know the shape of it, Laroche said. Everything else is rhythm. Holmes's hand dipped into his coat. You'll come with us now. For a moment, I thought Laroche might resist, but he merely lowered his gaze, then raised both hands in a slow, surrendering motion. I have no more pieces to play, he said. We led him out of the chapel and into the biting wind. As we descended the cliff path, he did not look back, but he hummed, quietly, steadily, the same broken motif we had seen scrawled again and again in his compositions. We turned him over to the authorities at Penzance, where Inspector Kerr of the local constabulary met us by arrangement. Holmes offered only a single sentence of explanation. The man is not mad, but dangerously brilliant. Let no performance take place near him again. It was 2 days later, back in Saint-Ouen-Git's Baker Street, that Holmes sat once more in his chair by the fire, the case now closed in every official sense. Yet he held still the cracked wooden mask in his hand, running a finger over its curling painted notes. Watson, he said slowly, the greatest deceptions are not those we see, but those we hear in the silence after. And he did not speak again for the rest of the night. The days that followed Laroche's arrest settled into a strange quiet. Outside, London returned to its rhythmic noise. The clatter of cabs, the cry of newsboys, the churn of coal carts over wet cobblestones. But within the rooms of Baker Street, Holmes remained oddly still. He made no remarks, offered no new deductions, and refused all other cases brought to his attention. I found him one morning sitting at the breakfast table, still in his robe, having read the same paragraph of the Times 3 times over without turning the page. I recognized the signs. He had resolved the puzzle, but something in its architecture continued to echo within him. Not a flaw in logic, but a dissonance that clung to the silence after the final note. He broke it only once that morning, and abruptly. Watson, do you remember the final chord in Laroche's chapel composition? I looked up from the post. You mean the written one? On the stand. Holmes tapped a finger against the table. Yes, he ended not in resolution, but disintegration. A descending scale in minor thirds. Unnatural. No proper cadence. It stops mid-line, unresolved. I set my teacup down. You think he meant to write more? Number, he meant to imply that something remained. Not musically, not emotionally, structurally. That ending was a door. He stood suddenly and crossed to the shelf, pulling down his notebook and flipping through the pages. There was a dissonance in his words as well, something rehearsed, too polished. Do you recall what he said when I placed him under arrest? I thought back. You'll come with us now, I'd heard Holmes say. Laroche had replied, I have no more pieces to play. Holmes turned, his eyes alight again. Not I am finished. Not I surrender, but no more pieces to play. As if someone else might. I stood now, uneasy. You believe there's another player involved. I believe there always was. He opened a drawer and produced the letter Laroche had sent to Lady Montcroix, the cryptic note scrawled in symbols and flourishes. Do not look behind the veil, Holmes repeated softly. The echoes are not yours to command. He passed me the page, and I read it again. On its surface, it was poetic, obscure, but now it felt like a warning, one Holmes had begun to take literally. There's someone else, he said, pacing slowly. Someone who remained hidden, even from Laroche's own narrative. A listener, perhaps even a patron. You mean he was funded? Possibly. Or inspired. All visionaries, even the most deranged, have their audience, and Laroche was never trying to vanish. He was trying to prove something, to someone, which means there's a second mind in this game. He retrieved the folded mask from its wrappings and held it under the gaslight. I had looked at the thing a dozen times by now, its polished cheekbones, the faint cracks of use, but Holmes was no longer studying its surface. He was studying its maker. This was carved by hand, birchwood, coated in linseed. But there's a faint mark inside. Here. He passed it to me, and I peered at the inner ridge. There, nearly erased by time and oil from the skin, was an impression. A tiny motif carved into the wood itself. It was not Laroche's monogram. An L intertwined with a P, Holmes said, and a date. Binsekis Yüzyetmiş Dokuz. That's nearly 6 years before Laroche even entered the Royal College. Precisely. He didn't make this. He inherited it. We stood there in silence as the implications unfurled. Holmes turned swiftly, the sharp, controlled urgency returning to his movements. There was a composer by that name, Lucien Prior, an experimentalist. I encountered him briefly during the Wilton Asylum inquiry. He believed sound was a spiritual bridge, obsessed with harmonics and ritual. But he was institutionalized in 1881, vanished 2 years later. I frowned. Vanished? Released to private care. The records were sealed, but before he disappeared, he published a single essay. The Architecture of Resonance. Half rambling philosophy, half acoustic theory. He posited that certain tones could fragment memory or alter perception if used in architectural spaces designed to amplify them. It was dismissed as lunacy. Until Laroche tried to prove it. Holmes nodded grimly. They were connected. Teacher and pupil, perhaps. Or something deeper. We must find out who took Lucien Prior from the institution and who may have continued to finance his theories. If there's a second mind behind this, they'll not remain idle now that Laroche has been silenced. By late afternoon, Holmes had secured an appointment at the private records office of the Wiltshire Lunatic Asylum, where Prior had been held for 2 years before his mysterious release. The administrator, a thin, beady-eyed man named Corbett, led us to the restricted archives with minimal protest once Holmes produced an endorsement from Scotland Yard. Corbett leafed through the dusty ledgers. Prior, yes. Admitted for auditory hallucinations, obsessive harmonic ideation, and detachment from reality. Released March 1883. Discharged to the care of a Mr. Octavian Bressett, gentleman scholar of independent means. Holmes's voice barely concealed its interest. An address? Corbett squinted. Greyward House, Somerset Coast. Holmes's eyes flicked to me. Another coastline. Another echo. We left within the hour. It was dark by the time our train reached the small station of Alminster. A hired cart carried us down a narrow track, past bracken and cliffs that dropped into invisible depths. Greywood House stood above the rocks like a monument to wind and erosion, 3 stories of crumbling grandeur, its windows dark, its iron gates left open as if awaiting us. The driver refused to stay. Holmes and I approached in silence, the crunch of gravel beneath our boots the only sound. The door was ajar. Inside, the house was silent. Not abandoned? No. The furniture was clean, the carpets swept, but no light, no voices. Holmes lit his lantern and moved from room to room. Shelves of musical scores lined the walls, diagrams of acoustic waveforms, manuscripts covered in both Latin and Greek, and one name repeated in the margins. Lucien Prior. But it was the drawing room that held the greatest answer. There, upon the fireplace mantel, stood a row of masks, 10 or more, all carved from the same pale wood. Each bore a different motif, a different symbolic pattern, but one detail was consistent. The mark, L entwined with P. Holmes, reached out and lifted one gently. "They weren't made for performance," he said. "They were made for study, to see how identity bends beneath ritual and sound." He stepped closer to the hearth. There lay a letter, addressed in the same looping hand as Laroche's script, but older. Dust lined its edges. He unfolded it and read silently, then handed it to me. "My dearest Gabriel, you will carry this forward when I can no longer hear the music. The mask is not the instrument. It is the silence into which you pour yourself. Each performance brings us closer to the moment when the world remembers its resonance. Find the last listener. Do not look back." L.P. Holmes turned to the window. The wind had picked up now, rushing against the glass with a hollow cry like breath through a reed. He said, "This is no longer about a crime, Watson. This is a philosophy, handed from mind to mind like a composition that can never end." I looked once more at the row of masks. "But how many more know the tune?" I asked quietly. Holmes's jaw set. "That is what we must now discover." And in the shadows beyond the window, I swear, for just a moment, it sounded as though something answered. Holmes did not speak during our return from Greyward House. The letter from Lucian Pryor rested inside his coat pocket, but it might as well have burned there for the heat it seemed to radiate through his silence. I knew the signs, the tension in his shoulders, the way he tapped two fingers in an irregular rhythm against the armrest of the railway compartment. Something had shifted. Not merely the direction of the case, but its scale. We were no longer pursuing a man. We were pursuing an idea, one that had taken root in others, long before Laroche had ever put a single note to paper. When we returned to Baker Street the following morning, the fog had thickened until the gas lamps glowed like ghosts. Holmes moved with deliberate focus, retrieving all the documents from the Alderbridge affair and laying them beside the letters, diagrams, and Pryor's essay. By midday, every inch of his desk was covered in fragments, score notations, dates, names of past pupils, obscure journals. He was searching for patterns, and he found one. "Watson," he said suddenly, "there are 4 names repeated in connection with Pryor's earliest experiments. Here, published letters to the Acoustic Journal, 1877 through 1880. Pryor signs under the pseudonym L.P., but in the correspondence, 3 other initials appear consistently: M.R., E.C., and H.L. He circled them with his pen. They were not students. They were collaborators. Do we know who they were? Only one with certainty. H.L. is almost certainly Horace Lindley, an organ maker who vanished in 1882 under suspicious circumstances. His workshop was found abandoned, the walls carved with harmonic diagrams. Scotland Yard filed it under nervous collapse. And the others? Holmes sat back. M.R. and E.C. remain elusive. But listen to this. He held up a clipping from a minor London periodical dated March of this year. A new performance collective has formed in Lambeth under the name The Echo Circle, promising immersive soundscapes and rituals of resonance. Attendance is strictly invitation only. I leaned closer. Laroche? I suspect not directly, but those words, rituals of resonance, they're lifted straight from Pryor's writings. Someone is continuing the philosophy, possibly even reformulating it into a public performance, a mask with a different face. Holmes stood. We must locate this echo circle. It proved no easy task. The echo circle, as it turned out, did not advertise. It was not in the playbills, nor the music columns. but its name recurred in whispers, traced through a young composer who vanished after one performance, a violinist found wandering the South Bank without memory, and a professor of sound theory who abruptly retired, claiming he could no longer distinguish between notes and dreams. After 2 days of inquiry, we received our first break. A contact of Holmes's in the Metropolitan Police, a soft-spoken man named Herrick who worked in missing persons, provided a list of addresses connected by common threads. Among them was a warehouse in Rotherhithe, leased under a shell company to an unnamed consortium of acoustic researchers. We arrived under the cover of twilight. The warehouse was squat and windowless, pressed against the river's edge, its entrance flanked by rusted loading crates and a padlocked door. Holmes examined the lock. It was old, but not unsophisticated. "Watson, keep watch." Within moments, he had it open. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, and the faint scent of varnish lingered beneath something more peculiar, ozone and candle wax. Holmes lit his lantern, and we stepped into the space. Our footfalls muffled by a thick carpet that stretched the length of the warehouse. At the center of the room stood a circle of chairs, 8 in total, placed precisely around a strange metal structure. It resembled a harp, but with no strings. A skeletal frame of tuned bars and copper arcs, its center open like the mouth of a bell. Around the circle, the walls had been lined with thick soundproofing, layered fabric, wool, and carved panels of wood bearing the same crescent and echo motif we had found at Alderbridge. Holmes's eyes narrowed. This was a chamber of controlled perception. They meant for no sound to escape, and perhaps no clarity to enter. He crossed to the chair nearest the harp and picked up a folded piece of paper left on the seat. Another score, but unlike the others, this one bore no notes. Only rests. Measured silences. Full bars of nothing, framed by tempo and measure. He held it to the lantern. It's a composition of absence, of deliberate quiet. Not just what is played, but what is withheld. I moved to the far wall where a cabinet sat half open. Inside, a row of thin cylindrical objects rested on velvet, phonograph cylinders. I took one and held it to the light. The label read only Session 4, Descent. Holmes joined me. "Pack them, all of them. These may hold the key to what they believed they were creating." Just as he said this, the door groaned. We turned sharply. A figure stood there, cloaked in a dark coat, face hidden behind a mask, not carved like Laroche's, but wrought of copper and thin leather, its surface etched with the same abstract sigils. For a moment, we froze. The figure did not move, but from behind the mask came a single sentence, calm, articulate, and terrifying in its familiarity. "You've come too soon. It isn't ready." Holmes stepped forward. "Who are you? What is this place?" The figure tilted their head slightly, as if considering the question, then answered with a chill that seemed to hollow the space. "We are the pause before the note." And then, without haste, they turned and vanished down the alley behind the warehouse before either of us could follow. Holmes gave chase, but the night swallowed the figure. No sound of footfall, no trace. We returned inside, locked the door behind us, and packed the phonograph cylinders into my case. Holmes stared once more at the circle of chairs, the unstruck instrument, the score of silence. "This isn't over, Watson," he said softly. "It has only shifted. From performance to congregation." I looked to him. "Do you believe the echo circle still meets?" He nodded slowly. "Yes. And now that they know we've entered their silence, they will listen back." We left the warehouse just before dawn, and as we crossed the river into the heart of London, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere, in some empty room, our footsteps were being echoed, measure for measure, by an audience that had not yet revealed itself. It was late that evening in Baker Street, and the lamps cast long amber shadows against the rain-speckled windows. The cylinders Holmes and I had taken from the Rotherhithe warehouse now lay in careful sequence along the mantelpiece, each one numbered in wax pencil. Session 1 through Session 6, though a seventh sat among them unmarked. Holmes had spent the better part of the afternoon constructing a makeshift phonograph from pieces of his personal collection, fine-tuning the stylus until the slightest imperfections in the grooves were faithfully rendered. We had dinner in silence, neither of us speaking beyond a word or two, both conscious of the tension that had slowly risen since the encounter with the masked figure. At last, as the coals settled in the grate and midnight approached, Holmes placed the first cylinder onto the turntable and lowered the needle. What followed was unlike any sound I had heard. It began with a low, droning chord, so low it seemed less heard than felt, vibrating through the floorboards like a slow exhalation from the lungs of the house itself. Then a pause, followed by the faintest flutter of something metallic, like the brushing of a wire against taut silk. It was not music, not exactly, but it had the rhythm of intention, and beneath it, unmistakably, the echo of a human breath. Holmes did not flinch. He listened with the stillness of a hunter. I could see his fingers tense slightly as the recording continued. After 2 minutes, the tone shifted. Sharper now, the drone interrupted by a sequence of soft clicks and modulations. Then silence. 4 seconds of it. And then a single, whispered word. Repeat. The cylinder spun down. Holmes exhaled and placed the second on the spindle. Again, the drone. Again, the metallic flutter. But this time, the clicks formed a pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short again. Morse, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. An invitation or a signal. We transcribed the pattern. It spelled one word, observe. He replaced the second cylinder with the third. This one was different. No drone. Only silence for nearly a minute. Then, faintly, a violin, played out of tune, slowly, as though from memory. A child's lullaby, halting and fragile. After that, a sound like something being struck underwater. A heartbeat? A metronome? Session 4 was titled Descent. It opened with the scraping of a chair on stone, followed by heavy breathing and the unmistakable echo of footsteps moving in a circle. We heard the voices of at least 3 people, all muffled and overlapping. Chanting? Humming? It was impossible to tell. The final sound before the cylinder ended was a sudden, sharp inhalation, followed by what could only be described as weeping. Holmes turned to me. They weren't recording performances. These were rituals, attempts, failures, or perhaps rehearsals. Session 5 was blank, nothing but static, an occasional pop of the stylus. Until, at the 45-second mark, the sound of something shattering. Glass, I thought. Then laughter, low, restrained, almost reverent. Session 6 was the most coherent. It began with a voice. A man's, clear, older, perhaps in his 60s. The accent was Oxbridge-educated, but his tone had the fervor of a sermon. To hear the note behind the note, one must unlearn the scale. Let the body cease its pattern. Let the ear forget the division of pitch and silence. There is no division. There is only the resonance beneath the name. Holmes' expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw clench. You are not the performer. You are the hall, the chamber, the audience of one, waiting to be played. Then, once again. Repeat. Holmes removed the cylinder and held up the final, unmarked one. He turned it slowly in his hands before setting it onto the device. This one was different. From the start, the acoustics were wrong, too clear, too intimate, as if the recording had been made not in a warehouse or a ritual chamber, but in a private room, a salon, perhaps a drawing room. And then, unmistakably, a voice we both knew. Gabrielle Laroche. The experiment has reached its boundary. She heard the echo but refused its call. That is strength. Not all are chosen. Not all should be. He paused. But I record this for the listener who follows, not the one who watches, the one who remembers. The resonance has passed from me. I heard it once beneath a stone. It spoke my name. And now I give it back. Silence followed. For nearly 30 seconds. Then, faintly, another voice. Software feminine. Measured. He was never yours to follow. Holmes sat bolt upright. The voice continued. You mimic the tone, but not the silence. You pretend not to hear what you already are. The circle continues. It has no center, only ears. Then the sound of wind, barely audible. And the recording ended. Neither of us spoke for some time. Finally, Holmes turned slowly in his chair and said, It is her. The one behind the veil. The voice? I asked. Yes. Not a follower. Not a student. The architect. He stood and paced once across the hearth. She allowed Laroche to act, perhaps even guided him, but she was not deceived by his failure, nor threatened by ours. She welcomed it. I felt a deep unease settle into my bones. You believe she meant for us to hear this? Unquestionably. These recordings were left behind as evidence, but not for a court. For us. As if she were composing her reply. And now we must answer. The fire cracked in the grate. Outside, the rain had begun to fall steadily. Holmes turned back to the phonograph. There's one more thread. He moved to his desk, pulling the prior essay once more from the stack. He flipped to the final page. Lucien Prior references an anonymous benefactor, he said. Someone who funded his research after his release from the asylum. The only clue is a single line. She hears in sleep what men fear to dream. He tapped the phrase. It's repeated here in Laroche's final score. And again in the voice on the unmarked cylinder. The woman exists, Watson, and she listens still. I swallowed hard. So what do we do? Holmes looked out the window into the slick black streets beyond. We listened back, but this time not as observers. He paused. We entered the circle. And in the silence that followed, I thought I heard something far off, faint but distinct, the distant sound of chairs being drawn slowly into place. It was 2 nights later when Holmes received the envelope. No stamp, no name. Simply left upon the step in the small hour before dawn, discovered by Mrs. Hudson when she fetched the milk. She brought it up with a frown, her eyes flicking to Holmes in that way she did when his cases turned strange, though she said nothing. Holmes took the envelope without comment, but his fingers were already tense before he slit it open. Inside was a single card, thick stock, embossed at the edges. The message on it was short, handwritten in the same fine slanted script we had heard on the final phonograph cylinder. You have heard the silence. Now hear what comes after. St. Cadman's Crossing. Sunday, midnight. One may enter. No more. Holmes read it once, then passed it silently to me. I read it twice. An invitation, I said. Or a warning? Holmes merely nodded. Both. I stared at him, the weight of the message settling in my chest. You're going? Yes. And I'm not. The corner of his mouth tightened. You know what we're walking into. A pattern of influence, not reason. This isn't deduction anymore. It's performance. A theater for one. He crossed to the window and looked out into the rain-slicked street below, the lamplight glinting across the panes like distant stars. If they want me to enter alone, it is because they intend for me to be changed by it, or tested. Possibly both. I set the card down. Holmes, this circle, whatever they are, it began as philosophy, but it has moved beyond that. It's performance without audience, ritual without end. If they take you inside, what's to guarantee they let you walk back out? Holmes turned then, and his voice was low but calm. Because I am not their convert, I am their mirror. We spent the next day in preparation, Holmes wrote 2 letters, one to Mycroft, sealed in thick wax and handed off to a trusted courier, and the other to Lestrade, though what instructions he gave in either I did not know. He reviewed the cylinders one last time, listening to the final recording in total darkness, seated alone in his chair. I waited in the adjoining room, the fire burning low, the walls of Baker Street seeming to lean inward with the pressure of what we now understood we were approaching. Sunday came grey and unremarkable. The city moved as it always did, grocers shouting, wheels clattering, bells marking the hour. But beneath it ran another rhythm, one I could not place. It felt as though something were being wound tighter. At 11:30, Holmes stood in the foyer, dressed plainly, the collar of his coat turned up, gloves tucked into his sleeve. He took nothing with him, no weapon, no notebook, only the final cylinder in his coat pocket and a small slip of paper with coordinates sketched in his own hand. I followed him as far as the cab. "Should anything happen," he said quietly, "you'll know where to look." Holmes, he placed a hand on my arm, and for once there was no wit in his expression, only resolve. "Trust me to find the silence, Watson, and return with the sound." The door closed, and the cab rattled off into the dark. St. Caedmon's Crossing lay beyond the old river line in Southwark, a forgotten church swallowed by industry, its spire long since toppled in a fire and never rebuilt. The building had once stood in the heart of a parish, but the parish had died, and what remained was skeletal, a husk of brick and soot, its doors chained, its windows bricked up decades before. Holmes arrived at midnight. The chains were gone. He stepped through the threshold, and the door swung shut behind him with a finality that echoed like a judge's gavel. Inside, it was pitch black. No torches, no candles, only a single point of faint blue light at the far end of the nave, where the altar once stood. He walked toward it. As his eyes adjusted, he saw them, 8 chairs in a circle, the same number as in Rotherhithe, each occupied, figures seated in silence, masked, each mask different. Some carved, some metal, one draped entirely in cloth. No one moved. They sat as if awaiting a cue. At the center of the circle stood the instrument, the same stringless frame we had seen before. But now it thrummed faintly, as if responding to something Holmes could not yet hear. The blue light pulsed once, then steadied. A voice spoke, the same voice from the unmarked cylinder. "You are not here to ask." Holmes did not answer. "You are here because you listened," the voice said, "because you heard what cannot be said. You believe sound must resolve, that each note seeks its rest." The light flared again, and in it Holmes could make out the speaker, a woman seated directly opposite him. Her mask was porcelain, unpainted, the mouth absent entirely. "But some chords," she said, "are not played to be heard. They are played to be felt, to awaken the chamber inside the listener." Holmes's voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "And what happens when that chamber echoes back?" She tilted her head. "Then it must be filled." Holmes stepped forward into the circle. "You brought Laroche into this," he said. "You let him test your theory on the vulnerable. You built spaces of silence and confusion and called it transcendence." A murmur rose from the others in the circle. Not speech, but a tone. A shared soft and growing. "You claim to listen," Holmes said, "but you are only repeating yourselves." The woman stood. "He was an instrument. You are an audience." Holmes removed the final cylinder from his pocket and held it out. "Then hear this." He crossed to the device, placed the cylinder onto its spindle. There was one, waiting, and wound the crank. He let the needle fall. Laroche's voice began again. She heard the echo, but refused its call. "That is strength." The figures fell silent. Even the hum ceased. The circle continues. It has no center. Holmes let it play to the end. Then silence, He turned back to them. You made yourselves hollow, so you could call it purity, but all I hear is absence. The masked woman said nothing, but her hand rose, and all 8 members stood. Holmes tensed, but they did not advance. Instead, they removed their masks, each in turn, slowly, deliberately. The woman last, and when the porcelain dropped from her face, Holmes saw that she was not what he expected. No ethereal mystic, no prophet. Just a woman, middle-aged, eyes sharp, and infinitely tired. She stepped forward and handed him a card. It bore only 5 words. Now you know our shape. Then she turned. The others did as well. And one by one they vanished into the dark of the side aisles, into the corridors of the ruined church, into the silence. Holmes stood alone. No applause, no violence, no climax, only resonance. He walked back out into the night. The door closed behind him, gently, and in the quiet that followed, he finally understood. The circle was not a cult. It was a mirror, and it had shown him what it needed to. He returned to Baker Street just after 3 in the morning. I was still awake, pacing, my nerves stretched thin. He stepped inside, removed his coat, and sat. For a long time he said nothing. Then he looked at me. They are not done, he said softly, but they believe the score is written. And is it? I asked. Holmes looked toward the window where the first lines of dawn were beginning to blur the black. No, he said. Not while we're still listening. The rain returned in the late afternoon, soft and steady, turning the windows of Baker Street into muted silver mirrors. Holmes sat at the desk, not with a case file, but with a single blank page before him and the final phonograph cylinder beside his right hand. The circle had receded, vanished into alleys, doorways, derelict chapels, and though the silence lingered, the echo had changed. We had not ended them, but we had shifted their rhythm. It had been 4 days since Holmes returned from St. Caedmon's Crossing. He had spoken little of what had passed, but I knew enough. I saw it in the way he now listened, not only to the words of others, but to the spaces between them, to how a breath carried meaning, to the cadence of absence. He had heard something in that ruined nave that had altered the way he observed the world, though it had not weakened his reason. If anything, it had deepened it, and yet it remained unfinished. I was reminded of the final chord Laroche had written, a line broken mid-phrase, a melody unresolved. That afternoon, Inspector Lestrade arrived unannounced. His hat was soaked, and his expression was one of grim satisfaction. "We've located the benefactor," he said. "The woman. Her name's Lydia Morven, former professor of comparative musicology at King's. Vanished from public life 5 years ago, appeared under aliases in 3 different European cities, all in connection with private performances held in acoustically isolated venues. The Rotherhithe lease was under a shell company tied to a trust she administers." Holmes nodded once. "She will never reappear in the form we encountered." "No," Lestrade agreed. "But the trust has been shut, the house in Somerset seized, and several of her recordings have been intercepted before circulation. That's the best we'll get, I suppose." "You won't find her," Holmes said calmly. "Not unless she wishes to be found, but you may find the next." He tapped the desk lightly. "There will always be another conductor." Lestrade gave a small, uncomfortable grunt. "You'll let us know if more surface?" Holmes inclined his head. When Lestrade left, I turned to him. "You're certain she's vanished?" "She has simply changed octave, Watson. You don't erase an idea by removing its originator. You mute the instrument, but the score survives." He stood and crossed to the fireplace where the last of the Rotherhithe cylinders now sat unplayed. He picked it up, considered it, then returned it to the fireproof safe and turned the key. "I have no desire to listen again," he said. "But you understood her," I said quietly. "Lydia Morven." Her aims, Holmes gazed into the embers. She sought to dissolve identity into sensation, to replace thought with resonance. A terrifying goal, but not entirely irrational. The danger wasn't in her method, but in her certainty. She believed the loss of self was clarity. He looked at me then, the fire catching the sharp lines of his face. That is where reason ends, Watson. Not in madness, but in the conviction that one has surpassed the need for doubt. Outside, the rain faded to a mist. Inside, Baker Street felt as it always had, solid, narrow, scented with old paper and pipe smoke. The circle would retreat now, Holmes said. Scatter, reform. It had no headquarters, no charter, only a score. A ritual passed in silence, awaiting its next interpreter. But now Holmes knew its rhythm. A week later, we received a letter from Iris Denham. She had returned to music. Not publicly, not yet, but she wrote of tentative steps, of playing alone, of hearing her own notes again, without fear they belonged to someone else. She did not ask what had happened beneath Alderbridge Hall. She did not name LaRoche. But she ended her letter with a phrase I recognized from Holmes himself. I've begun writing again. The melody isn't finished, but this time I will choose the ending. Holmes folded the letter carefully and slid it into the drawer beside the fireplace. He poured 2 cups of tea, passed one to me, and said nothing more that day. But I understood. The case of the footprints on the ballroom ceiling had ended not with an arrest, nor a courtroom, but with a recognition that some mysteries are compositions, not crimes, that some investigations lead not to answers, but to the edge of silence itself, and that even silence leaves traces, if one knows how and where to listen, 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 to listen,